Imagine for a second that we're tracking a suspect.
Okay.
And this is someone who thinks they are just a complete digital ghost. I mean, they've meticulously deleted their entire browsing history.
Right.
They've used all these system tools to hide their hard drive partitions. They've even gone through and painstakingly changed the file extensions of their illicit photos.
Oh, like renaming a standard image to some obscure system file.
Exactly, just to completely throw off investigators. So in their mind, they've totally erased their digital footprint. They built this impenetrable wall around their secrets. But they made one really fatal flaw.
Yeah, they usually overlook the structural fundamentals, like how digital storage actually works.
Right.
They think about the files the way a human interacts with them on a screen.
Yeah.
Not the way the physical hard drive platter or the solid-state memory actually holds that data.
Exactly. They didn't realize that a seemingly harmless, invisible 10-megabyte gap just sitting quietly on their hard drive is going to give them away entirely.
Yeah, or that the invisible mathematical calculations hidden deep inside a completely normal-looking photograph of, like, a coffee cup would actually be the smoking gun.
Right. These tiny, totally overlooked details, the microscopic bits and bytes that the operating system holds onto, are going to bring their entire empire crashing down.
Because the suspect thinks they're outsmarting the human investigator, but they forget that they cannot outsmart the file system itself.
Yeah.
The data always leaves a trace, if you just know where to look and how to interpret the underlying code.
And knowing exactly where to look is exactly why we are here today. So welcome, everyone, to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
If you're an MIS, CIS, IT, or just a general business student, and especially those of you joining us from Tarleton State University's Dr. Sam Pack College of Business, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here. Today, our mission is to explore Chapter 8 of our ongoing 15-part series. This is based on the Guide to Computer Forensics and Investigations, and we are jumping headfirst into the incredibly complex, often non-textual world of media files and digital forensics.
Which is really a logical progression from our previous discussions. I mean, last week we spent our time navigating the structural intricacies of Linux and Macintosh file systems.
Right.
We looked at how those operating systems allocate space and manage permissions and store text-based data. But today, the landscape completely shifts.
Yeah, it's a whole new ballgame.
Exactly. We're moving away from standard text documents and diving into media files, so images, audio, video. These files are fundamentally different. They are larger, structurally much more complex, and they just offer these vast hidden spaces where data can be intentionally concealed.
Oh, for sure. And before we unpack all of those secrets, I actually want to make a quick ask to you, our listener. If you want to position yourself for a really bright future in your chosen tech and business career, you need the kind of insider knowledge we're discussing today.
Definitely.
So please take a second right now to like, subscribe, share, and comment on the channel so you never miss an insight. And be sure to check the description below for valuable additional resources that will really help you in your lifelong learning journey. We want to see you succeed, and staying engaged with this material is really step one.
Yeah, and if we're going to understand how a suspect manipulates or hides evidence inside a photo, we first need to establish what a digital photograph actually is at the binary level.
Right, the anatomy of an image.
Exactly. We have to look at the anatomy.
Because when most of us take a picture on our smartphone or, a digital camera, we just look at the screen and see the picture.
Yeah.
But under the hood, the camera's hardware and software are making this massive number of decisions about how to capture and store that visual data. And there's a big divide right out of the gate between standard formats and the formats that professionals use. So let's dig into the RAW format versus the Exif format.
Okay, so when you use a higher-end digital camera, you often have the option to shoot in the RAW file format.
Right.
And the term RAW is quite literal here.
Literally raw data.
Right. When the camera sensor captures the light, it takes that data and saves it exactly as it was captured.
Wow.
There's absolutely no enhancement processing applied by the camera's internal software.
None at all.
None. It doesn't adjust the color, it doesn't compress the file to save space, and it doesn't artificially sharpen the edges. It is just the purest, highest quality version of the picture possible.
But there is a massive catch there, right? Because I can't just email a RAW file to my mom and expect her to be able to open it on a standard, 5-year-old tablet.
No, you can't. The major disadvantage of RAW files, particularly from a forensic standpoint and just a general usability standpoint, is that they are proprietary.
Right.
So a RAW file created by a Canon camera is structurally completely different from a RAW file created by a Nikon camera. Not all standard image viewers can display them out of the box.
Oh, wow.
To make a raw file usable or viewable on a standard device, it has to go through this really complex conversion process called demosaicing.
Demosaicing. That sounds like you're taking away a mosaic.
Well, in a way you actually are. The camera sensor captures light through a color filter array, which is literally a mosaic of red, green, and blue pixels.
Okay.
So demosaicing is the mathematical algorithm that translates that raw mosaic sensor data into a standard viewable format where every single pixel has a full color value, and then eventually saves it as something universally recognized, like a JPEG or a TIFF.
Okay, so if raw files are proprietary, hard to view, and I imagine they take up massive amounts of storage space, why do professionals even use them?
That's a great question.
Like, from a business or investigative standpoint, why wouldn't people just use standard JPEGs from the start? It seems like RAW is just asking for a compatibility nightmare.
It is a trade-off, really, between convenience and ultimate control. Professionals use RAW precisely because no in-camera processing has occurred.
Right.
If you shoot a standard JPEG, the camera makes permanent, irreversible decisions about white balance, contrast, and color saturation before it even saves the file.
Oh, so it bakes it in.
Exactly. And if the camera's software gets it wrong, you can't easily fix it without degrading the image further. With a RAW file, you possess the total spectrum of captured light data. This allows you to manipulate the image in post-production with just incredible precision.
Wow. Okay.
And for a forensic investigator, finding a RAW file is actually a massive victory. It represents the unaltered, absolute truth of what the camera sensor saw, completely free of any software interpretation or compression artifacts.
That makes perfect sense. It's the unvarnished truth. But obviously most casual users, and honestly many suspects, aren't shooting in RAW.
No, they aren't.
They're shooting standard images, which brings us to Exif. And I know Exif stands for Exchangeable Image File Format, but it's not really a standalone format like a PNG, right? It's more like a bolt-on addition to JPEGs and TIFFs.
Yeah, Exif was developed as a standardized way to store metadata. It is an enhancement to those standard formats. What Exif does is modify the very beginning of the file, which we call the file header, so that a massive amount of metadata can be inserted right alongside the actual visual image data.
And when we talk about metadata, we mean data about the data.
Right.
So imagine an investigator searching a suspect's drive. Let's say Destiny is working a case, and she finds a folder full of Exif formatted digital photos. What exactly is she going to extract from that metadata?
Destiny is going to find an absolute goldmine of context. The Exif data will reveal the exact make and model of the camera or smartphone used to take the picture. It'll often record the unique serial number of the device. It records the date and time the picture was taken down to the literal second. It logs highly specific technical details too, so the exposure time, the f number, the ISO speed ratings, whether the camera flash fired, and the focal length of the lens.
But here's where it gets incredibly powerful for an investigation, though. If those photos were taken on a modern smartphone or an advanced digital camera with GPS capabilities enabled, Destiny gets something far more valuable than just camera settings.
She gets exact geolocation data. The Exif metadata literally records the specific latitude and longitude coordinates of where the device was physically standing when the shutter clicked.
Wow.
Yeah, consider the evidentiary value of that in a business or criminal investigation. A suspect claims they were working from their home office in Chicago on a specific date.
Right.
But Destiny pulls an Exif JPEG the suspect took that afternoon, and the metadata places them in a specific building in Miami. That single piece of hidden structural data completely destroys an alibi.
It really highlights how our devices are constantly recording reality in ways we just don't consciously think about.
Absolutely.
But beyond the metadata, we also need to understand how the actual visual part of the image is built. Investigators deal with different types of graphics constantly. So let's break down the fundamental difference between a bitmap or raster image and a vector graphic.
Let's start with bitmap images, which, are frequently referred to as raster images.
Yeah.
A bitmap stores visual information as a massive grid of individual dots, which we call pixels.
Right, short for picture elements.
Exactly. When you look at a photograph on a computer screen, you aren't looking at a continuous image. You are looking at millions of tiny independent squares of color arranged in rows and columns.
And because it's just a rigid grid of dots, the overall quality of that image is heavily dependent on a few very specific structural factors.
Oh, completely. The image quality of a bitmap is governed primarily by its resolution, which is the density of pixels displayed on the screen. The more pixels you have crammed into a specific area, the more detailed and crisp the image appears.
Makes sense.
But it's not just about the file itself. The visual quality is also profoundly affected by the hardware and software viewing it.
Oh, like the monitor.
Yeah, the advanced electronics of your video card, the amount of memory that card has, the specific software drivers, and the number of color bits the monitor is capable of displaying. All of that contributes to how good that grid of pixels actually looks to the human eye.
Okay, so a bitmap is fundamentally a grid of colored dots. But a vector graphic is something completely different. It's not made of dots at all, right?
Right. Vector graphics completely abandon the concept of pixels. Instead, they use complex mathematical formulas and instructions to draw lines, curves, text, and geometric shapes.
Okay.
Programs like CorelDRAW and Adobe Illustrator create vector files. When you save a vector graphic, you aren't saving a massive map of colors. You are basically saving the mathematical calculations required to render that image on demand.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I have the mechanics of this right.
Sure, go for it.
A vector file is like a written recipe for a cake. Because it's just a set of instructions, I can scale that recipe up to bake a massive 10-tier wedding cake, or scale it down to bake a single tiny cupcake.
Yeah.
And the fundamental quality, the ratios, and the instructions remain absolutely perfect regardless of the size. But a bitmap image is like the finished baked cake itself. If I try to take a small cupcake and physically stretch it out to feed 100 people at a wedding, it's just going to fall apart, lose its structure, and look terrible.
That is a perfect analogy.
Sure.
When you enlarge a vector graphic, the software simply recalculates the math for a larger size. It redraws the lines based on the new dimensions, so it never loses quality.
Right.
The edges remain razor sharp, whether it's on a business card or a massive billboard. But if you try to enlarge a bitmap, the software has to basically guess what colors to fill into the new empty spaces that are created between the pixels as they stretch apart.
Oh, the stretching.
Yeah, and this process results in that blurry, blocky, pixelated look we've all seen when trying to zoom in too far in a small photo.
And there is a third category that combines them called metafile graphics.
Yes, metafiles integrate both raster and vector characteristics. Imagine an investigator scans a physical, printed photograph into their computer. That creates a standard bitmap image.
Okay.
Then they open that image in a presentation program and draw bright red arrows and text boxes over it to point out a specific clue for a courtroom display. The underlying scanned photo is a bitmap, but the arrows and text drawn on top are vector.
Ah, I see.
So if they try to enlarge that entire metafile for a large projector, the photograph in the background will become blurry and lose resolution, but the arrows and text they drew on top will scale mathematically and remain perfectly sharp and clear.
Dealing with all these different formats introduces a major headache for forensics, though. Let's consider a real-world scenario, our Xavier case study. Xavier's examining photos pulled from a suspect's smartphone. The suspect had downloaded these photos, but when transferring them, they actively changed the format from a standard JPEG to a TIFF file. Why does a simple format change cause so much trouble for the investigation?
The trouble stems from what happens to the hidden data during that conversion process. When you take a file from its original format, like JPEG, and force it into a completely new format, like TIFF, the software performing that conversion often alters, strips away, or totally corrupts the original Exif metadata.
Oh, wow. So the data's just gone.
Or changed. The date and time the photo was taken might be overwritten with the date and time the conversion occurred.
Yikes.
The critical geolocation data might be dropped entirely because the new format doesn't know where to put it. Because the suspect changed the format, Xavier knows that the surrounding metadata is no longer reliable. He cannot take it at face value.
Okay, so what's the rule then?
Therefore, as an absolute rule, image files found on a suspect's computer drive that have undergone format changes must be treated subjectively. They require external corroboration before they could be trusted in an investigation.
Okay, so since we understand that media files are rich, incredibly detailed, and structurally quite large, especially those raw files or high-resolution bitmaps, it raises a very practical business question.
Yeah.
How do we store or transmit these massive files over a corporate network without just clogging up the entire system? And this leads us to Section 2, the mechanics of squeezing the data and the forensic trade-offs of compression.
Right, because compression is a fundamental, everyday necessity in modern computing. There are two primary business reasons why data is intentionally compressed: to save local storage space on a hard drive or server, or to minimize the massive quantity of data being transmitted over a network connection to save bandwidth and transfer time.
Makes total sense.
But from a digital forensics perspective, exactly how that compression is achieved matters immensely because it changes the nature of the evidence itself.
And there are two main categories we need to explore, lossless and lossy compression. Let's start with the safer of the two, lossless.
Lossless compression is exactly what the name implies. It is a technique that reduces the overall file size without actually removing or permanently losing any of the original data.
Wait, how is that possible?
It relies on sophisticated mathematical algorithms, typically Huffman coding or Lempel-Ziv-Welch, commonly known as LZW coding.
Okay, how does LZW coding actually work in practice to shrink a file without losing anything?
It basically looks for structural redundancy. Let's say you have an image with a massive clear blue sky. In the uncompressed file, the raw data might literally say pixel 1 is blue, pixel 2 is blue, pixel 3 is blue, repeating that exact same instruction thousands of times.
Oh, that's incredibly inefficient.
Exactly. Lossless compression algorithms recognize that repetition. They replace that massive repetitive string of data with a short, efficient code that essentially says the next 5,000 pixels are all this exact shade of blue.
Wow, okay.
You see utilities like WinZip, 7-Zip, or PKZip doing this every day. The GIF format is also a classic example of a lossless image format. The critical forensic takeaway here is that when you uncompress a lossless file, the algorithm expands that shorthand back out, producing an exact bit-for-bit replica of the original data.
But then we have lossy compression, which is a completely different approach to the problem.
Very different. Lossy compression achieves much smaller file sizes, but it does so by actually permanently discarding bits of information from the file.
Throwing them away entirely.
Exactly. It uses complex algorithms like vector quantization or VQ. Vector quantization analyzes the visual data and makes calculated mathematical decision about what bits of information the human eye or ear won't realistically notice are missing, and it simply throws them away.
Oh, fascinating.
It uses an algorithm similar to rounding off long decimal values in math to eliminate unnecessary precision. The JPEG format is the most famous, globally used example of lossy compression.
Which creates a serious problem if a file is handled multiple times. Let's look at the Isabella case study. Isabella is looking at a JPEG file on a suspect's hard drive, and she notices the image quality is incredibly degraded, blocky, and just full of artifacts. She knows camera quality plays a part, but what else causes a JPEG to degrade so severely over time?
Because JPEG uses lossy compression, it permanently loses data every single time the file is saved.
Every time.
Every single time. If the suspect opened the JPEG to view it, made a minor edit like cropping it slightly, and saved it with a new name, the lossy algorithm runs again. Then they open it the next day, edit it again, and save it again.
Wow.
Every single time that save action occurs, the compression algorithm analyzes the remaining data and discards more bits. It's like making a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Eventually, the constantly removed bits of information significantly reduce the underlying image quality, leaving you with a degraded, heavily pixelated mess.
Okay, let's look at the legal implications of this. Because if lossy compression permanently destroys data, and the resulting file is what the field calls an altered replica rather than an exact replica, wouldn't a defense attorney immediately jump on that?
Oh, they definitely would try.
Right. Couldn't they argue in court that a compressed JPEG found on a computer is no longer the true original evidence? Because it's essentially just a mathematical simulation of what the camera actually saw, missing thousands of original data points, and therefore it should be inadmissible.
It is a very sharp theoretical argument, and it touches on the philosophy of digital evidence. However, the legal and forensic consensus is focused on the state of the data as it relates to the suspect.
Ah, okay.
The digital file, exactly as it exists on the suspect's storage media, is the original evidence for the purpose of the investigation. While a JPEG is technically an altered replica of the light that hit the camera sensor, it is the original, unadulterated file as it pertains to the computer system we are investigating.
That makes total sense.
All right, forensics handles these mathematical simulations by validating the file's integrity exactly as it was found on the drive. We aren't arguing in court that the JPEG is a perfect, lossless representation of reality. We are arguing that the JPEG is a perfect representation of the exact file the suspect possessed and interacted with.
Yes.
As long as we can prove mathematically that we haven't altered it further during our own investigation, it remains entirely admissible.
That distinction really clarifies things perfectly. We're authenticating the suspect's file, not the physics of the camera. Now, compressing data to save space is a normal, innocent business practice.
Yeah.
But what happens when the alteration of data isn't designed to save space on a hard drive? What if the goal is to intentionally hide a secret message in plain sight? And that takes us into Section 3, the world of digital invisibility cloaks, exploring steganography and copyrights.
Now we are moving away from standard data management and into intentional obfuscation. Steganography is an ancient concept. The word literally translates from Greek as covered writing. In the digital realm, steganography is defined as a cryptographic technique for embedding hidden information inside another seemingly normal file, so that casual observers have no idea the hidden message even exists. The normal-looking file that contains no hidden message yet is called the cover media. Once a secret message is actively injected into it, it becomes the stegomedia.
And there are two primary methods used to create this stegomedia, right? Insertion and substitution.
Yeah, an insertion is the simpler of the two methods. It involves finding naturally occurring unused or hidden areas within the host file's existing structure and literally placing the secret data into those empty spaces.
Okay, so just tucking it away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't overwrite any of the original functional data, the host file still opens and operates normally in its associated program. You wouldn't have a clue the extra data was sitting in there unless you carefully analyzed the file's underlying binary structure.
I picture insertion like me writing a secret note on a piece of paper and simply sliding it between the pages of a thick novel on a bookshelf.
Yeah, good analogy.
If you look at the book on the shelf, it looks totally normal. If you take it down, you can still read the story perfectly. You'd only find the secret note if you meticulously flip through every single page. But substitution is a lot more insidious than just slipping a note inside.
Much more insidious. Substitution doesn't just look for empty space to add data. It actually replaces existing bits of the host file with the secret data. The most common and effective technique for this is manipulating the least significant bit, or LSB.
LSB, okay.
Imagine a single byte of data representing a specific color in a bitmap image. That byte is a string of 8 zeros and ones. The bit on the far left of that string is the most significant bit. Changing it would drastically alter the numeric value and therefore drastically change the color on the screen.
Everyone would notice that.
Exactly. But the bit on the far right is the least significant bit. If you change a 0 to a 1 in that final position, the resulting numeric shift is so tiny and the resulting color shift on the screen is so infinitesimally small that the human visual system cannot possibly detect the difference.
Wow, so extending the book analogy, substitution is like taking a tiny dab of whiteout and rewriting one single specific letter on every single page of that novel. The book looks identical at a glance. The story still reads exactly the same, but if you know the pattern, extract all those slightly altered letters and put them together, they spell out a completely different secret code.
That's exactly how it works.
It's fascinating, and it explains why graphic files, especially uncompressed ones, are ideal for this. They have millions of pixels, which means millions of least significant bits you can safely manipulate to hide a massive message.
And because it's so incredibly well hidden visually, detecting it, a specialized process called steganalysis, is very difficult. If investigators suspect steganography is being used, they first look for environmental clues on the drive. For instance, if they find a known steganography program installed on the suspect's computer or in their download history, that's a massive red flag. Yeah. Another strong clue is finding duplicate image files on the drive that look perfectly identical to the eye, but have completely different hash values, indicating their underlying binary code has been secretly changed.
And if an investigator confirms their suspicion and believes a file is stegomedia, there are 5 specific methods or attacks they use to try and crack it and extract the message. How do they approach this?
It requires a highly analytical approach. First is the stego-only attack. This is the most difficult scenario. You only have the suspected file in your possession. You have to try and detect statistical anomalies or unusual mathematical patterns in the data to prove a hidden message is even there, let alone extract it.
That sounds almost impossible.
It's tough. Second is the known cover attack. This is much easier. This is when you have both the suspected stegomedia and the original unaltered cover media. You can compare them side by side, bit by bit, to see exactly what specific bits were changed, which reveals the hidden data.
Oh, that makes sense. Just spot the differences.
Right. Third is the known message attack. In this scenario, you already know the secret message, perhaps because an informant told you. You analyze the stegomedia to figure out exactly how the suspect software hid that specific message. Understanding the method helps you build a profile to find other hidden messages.
Okay, so reverse engineering based on the message.
Exactly. Fourth is the chosen Stego attack.
Mm-hmm.
Here, you know exactly what steganography tool the suspect used, and you have the Stego media. You use their own tool to reverse engineer the process and pull the message out.
Nice.
And fifth is the chosen message attack. You use the suspect's tool to purposefully hide a new message of your own choosing into a blank file. You then analyze the resulting mathematical patterns the tool creates, which acts as a map to help you crack their original file.
Those are intense, highly technical analytical techniques, but steganography isn't just used in images. Let's look at the Jaden case study. Jaden is searching a suspect's computer. The suspect is a known distributor of illicit materials, but all Jaden can find are a bunch of completely legitimate-looking saved web pages. How might the suspect be hiding messages in plain sight using the internet?
They're likely dealing with HTML steganography. When you open a saved web page by double-clicking it, it renders in a browser and looks like a totally normal site, maybe a news article or a recipe blog.
Right.
But HTML, the underlying language that builds the web page, allows for hidden structural tags. The suspect can embed secret text or even links to illicit servers within an HTML tag, structured as an input type hidden tag.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the web browser reads that tag and intentionally follows the instruction not to display the text on the screen. So to find this evidence, Jaden cannot rely on looking at the web page visually. He has to bypass the browser, open the HTML file in a raw text editor like Notepad, or right-click and select View Source to manually search the raw HTML code for those hidden text strings.
It's all about looking beneath the visual surface. Now, we've talked extensively about steganography as a tool for criminals trying to hide data, but it actually has vital, legitimate business uses, specifically regarding copyright protection.
Absolutely. Steganography is widely used by corporations and creators to protect intellectual property through digital watermarks. A professional photographer or media company can use steganography, like the LSB substitution we just discussed, to embed an invisible copyright notice, a creator's name, or a unique tracking identifier directly into the pixels of their image.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, so if someone steals that image and puts it on their own commercial website, the original creator can analyze the stolen file, extract the hidden steganographic watermark, and conclusively prove ownership in a civil court.
Which brings up the often murky world of copyright law itself, because digital investigators frequently work corporate cases where they have to determine if a crime or a civil violation has actually occurred regarding intellectual property. Consider our Gerald case study. Gerald is a community college professor. He takes multiple excerpts from his favorite authors and compiles them into an English class study guide. He firmly believes he's operating under fair use guidelines.
Okay.
However, instead of emailing the guide, Gerald takes it to a local commercial copy shop and pays the business to print 40 physical copies for his students. Has a violation occurred here?
Yes. The line into copyright infringement was crossed. Fair use is a legal guideline that allows for the free, limited use of copyrighted material for very specific protected purposes like news reporting, critiques, and non-commercial educational use.
Right.
If the professor had simply emailed the digital excerpts to the students or printed them on a personal printer, they would likely be protected under the educational exemption. But the moment they went to a commercial printer and paid them to reproduce the copyrighted material, a commercial transaction occurred involving someone else's intellectual property.
The commercial aspect changes everything.
Exactly. Because a commercial entity profited from the act of reproducing the copyrighted work, it violates the non-commercial spirit of the fair use exemption. Digital investigators working corporate IP cases need to be acutely aware of these boundaries. Though it's worth noting that copyright laws for the internet are incredibly complex, and there is no universal international copyright law. We generally rely on the U.S. Copyright Office guidelines when dealing with domestic cases.
That is a subtle but absolutely crucial distinction for anyone entering the business world to understand. Commercial profit changes the entire legal landscape. So steganography is incredibly clever, but it requires specialized third-party software tools to execute. Sometimes, the suspects don't want to rely on external software. They want to use the operating system itself to hide their tracks. And this brings us to Section 4, the forensics game of hide-and-seek, system-level data hiding.
Yeah, when a suspect tries to hide data at the system level, they are relying on a very specific assumption. They assume the investigator is lazy.
Wow, okay.
They assume the investigator will only use standard file browsers like Windows Explorer or Mac Finder to look around, rather than utilizing dedicated forensic tools. The most basic entry-level trick relying on this assumption is simply changing the file extension.
Let's play that out. A suspect has an incriminating photo. Let's call it evidence.jpg. They simply right-click, select rename, and change it to something obscure, like evidence.exif, or even just a standard text file like evidence.txt. When you double-click that renamed file, the operating system gets confused. It tries to open a picture using a text editor, fails, and throws an error. To a casual observer, it just looks like a broken, corrupted, or unimportant system file.
That is exactly what happens in the operating system. But this trick is incredibly easy for investigators to defeat. Advanced digital forensic tools don't care what the arbitrary name of the file is. They completely bypass the extension and look directly at the file header, the underlying hexadecimal code at the very beginning of the file that structurally announces what the file actually is.
Oh, so it leads the true identity.
Right. If the forensic tool analyzes a file named with a .txt extension, but the internal hex header clearly says it's a JPEG image, the tool immediately flags it as a deliberately altered mismatched file. This immediately makes the suspect look highly suspicious and draws intense scrutiny to that specific file.
But suspects have much more advanced, mathematically complex tricks up their sleeves, like bit shifting. How does bit shifting actually scramble data?
Bit shifting is a data obfuscation method that literally shifts the binary data of a file at the machine level. Remember that all digital data, at its core, is just binary zeros and ones.
Right.
Let's say you have a single byte of data that represents the letter A. In binary code, that is represented as 01000001. A bit-shifting program takes all those digits and shifts them one or more spaces to the left or the right within the byte. If we shift that string one space to the left, the 0 on the far left falls off, a new 0 is added to the right, and the sequence becomes 100,000,010.
And shifting those ones and zeros changes the value entirely.
It changes it dramatically. At a mathematical level, shifting binary data to the left effectively multiplies the numeric value by 2, and shifting to the right divides it by 2. But practically speaking, what it achieves is taking completely readable code like an English. If an investigator opens a bit-shifted file in a hexadecimal editor, it doesn't look like text or an image anymore. The structure is destroyed. It looks like raw, compiled, binary executable code.
That's incredibly deceptive because it fundamentally changes the digital signature of the file. I know some corporate antivirus programs rely on running a quick hash check on a file to see if it's malware, but advanced malware actually uses bit shifting on its own code to constantly change its signature and hide from those very scanners. So how does an investigator combat this shifting technique?
You have to shift the data back to its original position. Forensic tools like WinHex and HexWorkshop include specific features for shifting bits left or right to try and reverse the obfuscation.
Okay.
However, to truly understand, identify, and analyze data that might involve complex bit shifting, investigators really should consider getting advanced training in assembly language and higher-level programming. You need to intimately understand how the computer processor actually reads and executes binary instructions to recognize when a block of code has been artificially shifted rather than naturally compiled.
Let's look at another system-level trick that manipulates the physical layout of the drive. Hidden partitions. This is the Edward case study. Edward is an investigator examining the disk management utility on a suspect's Windows machine. He is looking at the overall layout of the physical hard drive, and he notices a 10-megabyte gap sitting quietly between two standard partitions.
Oh, yeah.
The system labels it as unallocated, and there is no drive letter assigned to it, like a standard C drive or D drive. What is Edward actually looking at here?
Edward has almost certainly found an intentionally hidden partition. This is a space on the physical hard drive that has been fully formatted to hold data. But the suspect used a built-in Windows command line utility called diskpart to make it invisible.
Okay.
Specifically, they used the command diskpart remove letter. By stripping away the drive letter, the operating system stops displaying the partition in File Explorer. The average user browsing through the computer would never see it or know it existed, but the data written to that partition is still physically there on the disk.
So an investigator shouldn't just assume that 10-megabyte space is normal fragmented data or leftover system startup files.
Absolutely not. A fully formed gap like that without an assigned drive letter has almost certainly been intentionally removed from view to hide data. To defeat this and see what's inside, Edward doesn't even need expensive forensic software. He can simply open a command prompt, launch the same diskpart utility the suspect used, and execute the command diskpart assign letter.
Just give it a letter.
Exactly. The moment they assign it a new letter, the partition pops back into existence in File Explorer, and they can browse all the hidden files normally. Of course, any decent commercial forensic imaging tool will automatically detect these hidden partitions during the initial scan anyway, accounting for every single sector of disk space on the drive, regardless of drive letters.
That brings us to another fascinating, if slightly historically older, system-level technique, the Audrey case study. Audrey is analyzing an older FAT file system file allocation table, and she notices several clusters of data explicitly marked as bad by the system. Why are these bad clusters actually a massive red flag in an investigation?
To understand why it's a red flag, we have to know how operating systems naturally treat bad clusters. When a physical hard drive is manufactured, or as it ages and degrades, physical microscopic defects can occur on the magnetic platters.
Okay, natural wear and tear.
Right. If the operating system tries to write data to one of those defective spots and the read-or-write process fails, it updates the file allocation table and marks that specific cluster as bad. Once marked bad, the OS essentially builds a wall around it. It will never try to read data from or write new data to that space ever again.
It's basically condemned real estate on the hard drive.
Exactly. So clever suspects figured out that they could use older, low-level disk utilities like Norton Disk Edit running in a raw MS-DOS environment to manually bypass the operating system, go directly into the FAT, and fraudulently mark perfectly good functional clusters as bad.
That's brilliant in a devious way. If the suspect puts their incriminating files in a perfectly good cluster and then manually flags that cluster as bad in the table, the Windows operating system will just ignore it completely. It won't index it for a search. It won't show up in File Explorer. It's perfectly hidden in plain sight because the OS refuses to look there.
Spot on. So when Audrey is examining this type of drive, she knows that good clusters can be artificially marked as bad to hide evidence. Because bad clusters are effectively invisible to the operating system, they are a prime hiding spot for illicit data. To counter this, she must use a hexadecimal disk editor, bypass the OS entirely, manually look at the clusters marked bad, and flip their status back to good.
And then it's visible again.
Yep. Once she removes the condemn sign, she can read whatever data the suspect tried to bury in that space.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of our listeners, especially the business and IT students preparing to enter the modern workforce.
Sure, go ahead.
They are probably never going to boot up an MS-DOS machine to run Norton Disk Edit. They might never even encounter a FAT file system from the 1990s in a modern corporate enterprise environment. So why are we spending time discussing this historical technique? Why does this specific trick matter to a professional today?
It matters deeply because we are exploring the foundational philosophy of cybersecurity and digital forensics. You must understand how operating systems conceptually categorize space, what the system considers allocated for use, what is free to be written over, and what is flagged as unusable.
Okay, the concepts.
Exactly. The specific software tool like Norton Disk Edit might be completely obsolete, but the underlying concept of manipulating the file system's metadata to trick the operating system into intentionally ignoring a space where a malicious payload is hidden is exactly how modern, sophisticated rootkits and advanced malware operate today.
Oh,
If you understand the mechanics of the FAT bad cluster trick, you understand the foundational philosophy of evasion that modern threat actors still rely on to breach corporate networks.
okay, the tools evolve, but the philosophy of hiding remains exactly the same. But, even if the investigator finds the hidden partition or unmasks the bad cluster or manages to reverse the bit shifting, the suspects still have one massive wall of defense left to protect their data: encryption. And this leads us to Section 5, the complex challenge of breaking the locks.
Yeah, encryption is the ultimate investigative hurdle. Encrypted files are mathematically encoded using a complex algorithm and a specific key to prevent unauthorized access. If you find an encrypted file, it doesn't matter if you know where it is on the drive or what format it's supposed to be in. Without the correct password or passphrase to decode the math, recovering the contents is incredibly difficult, and depending on the encryption strength, sometimes practically impossible.
Unless you are working in a corporate environment and have a built-in backdoor, right, like key escrow.
Yes, that is a major difference between private and corporate investigations. Many commercial encryption programs, especially those deployed across enterprise business environments, utilize a technology called key escrow.
Okay.
It is a fail-safe system designed to recover encrypted data if an employee forgets their passphrase, leaves the company suddenly, or if the local encryption key gets corrupted during a system failure. The organization essentially holds a master key in escrow.
That's super convenient.
It is. If an investigator is dealing with a corporate machine, they can often compel the company's IT department to use their key escrow to instantly decrypt the evidence. But if it's a private suspect using personal standalone encryption software, there is no master key. You have to crack it.
And there are two main brute force ways to crack a password. Let me use an analogy to break them down. Let's say the password is a 4-digit combination lock on a safe. A brute force attack is me sitting in front of that safe, spinning the dials, trying 0000, then 0001, then 0002, all the way up to 99999. It is mathematically guaranteed to eventually find the right combination, but it is agonizingly slow, requires massive amounts of time, and uses a huge amount of computer processing power to try every single variable.
That captures the reality perfectly.
Yeah.
Brute force software tries every single possible letter, number, and special character found on a keyboard in every possible combination. If the password is long and complex, say 15 randomized characters, a true brute force attack could literally take thousands of years to complete with current standard computing power. It is highly inefficient.
So it's the faster alternative of the dictionary attack. Going back to my combo lock analogy, if I know the safe belongs to someone who was born in 1985, I'm not going to start spinning dials at 0000. I'm going to try the combination 1985 first.
Yeah, but much smarter.
A dictionary attack uses a program loaded with millions of common words found in the dictionary across multiple languages and tries those as passwords first. It relies on the fact that humans are notoriously lazy and often use real, memorable words rather than random characters.
Yes, and investigators can make dictionary attacks vastly more effective by profiling the suspect. This is the Darla case study. Darla is trying to crack a specific suspect's personal computer. Instead of just running a standard generic dictionary file, she spends hours scouring the suspect's public social media account.
Oh, getting personal.
Exactly. She gathers the names of the suspect's pets, the names of their children, their favorite sports teams, their birth dates, their favorite colors, the street they grew up on, and the names of their high schools.
She's building a psychological profile to attack the password.
Exactly. She takes all of this highly personalized data and feeds it into her password cracking software to create a hybrid dictionary attack. She is banking on the psychological reality that people use passwords that are deeply meaningful and easy for them to remember. By inserting these unique, personally relevant words extracted from social media into the dictionary, and having the software combine them, like Fido 1985, she dramatically increases her chances of cracking the password quickly without resorting to a full brute force attempt.
That's incredibly effective. But there's an even faster way, mathematically speaking, to crack a password, provided you have access to the right pre-computed files. Let's talk about rainbow tables and the Stephen case study. Stephen is dealing with SHA passwords. Now, when you type a password into a modern system, the system doesn't save the plain text word password123 in its database, right?
Well, it doesn't.
It runs that text through a one-way cryptographic algorithm to generate a fixed-length string of seemingly random characters called a hash value and saves that hash instead. When you log in the next day, it hashes whatever you typed and compares the new hash to the saved hash. If they match, you're granted access.
That is the standard security protocol. And calculating those hashes take a tiny fraction of CPU time. However, over millions or billions of guesses in a standard brute force or dictionary attack, that constant calculation time adds up massively, slowing the whole process down.
Okay.
To bypass the immense CPU demand of constantly generating new hashes to check against the suspect's hash, investigators like Stephen use rainbow tables.
Okay, so going back to the lock analogy, rainbow tables are like having a massive leaked master cheat sheet that lists the combination for every single lock ever manufactured by that company. You don't have to spin the dials, you just look up the serial number.
Exactly. A rainbow table is essentially a massive multi-terabyte database file that contains the pre-computed hash values for virtually every possible password that can be generated from a keyboard up to a certain length.
Wow, multi-terabyte.
Yeah, it's huge. Because the table already contains the final computed hash values, the cracking software doesn't have to spend any CPU power doing mathematical conversions from plain text to hash. It simply looks at the hash stolen from the suspect's computer and searches the massive rainbow table database to see if that exact hash exists.
If it does?
If it finds a match, the table immediately tells the software what the original plain text password was. It requires massive physical storage space to hold the tables, but it reduces CPU demand and speeds up the cracking process exponentially.
But of course, corporate security professionals are well aware of rainbow tables, so they invented a mathematical countermeasure. How does the process of salting defeat this?
Salting passwords effectively ruins the usefulness of rainbow tables. Salting is the process of taking the user's plaintext password, and before it gets run through the hashing algorithm, the system appends a string of random, unique bits, which we call the salt, to the end of it.
Okay, so password 123 becomes something like password 123XY7ZP.
Right. Then and only then does it hash that combined string. Because those random bits are added, the resulting hash value is completely radically altered.
Oh, I see.
Since rainbow tables only contain pre-computed hashes for standard unsalted passwords, they will never, ever have a match for a password that has been salted with random system-generated data. Salting forces the attacker back to slow, CPU-intensive brute force methods, making cracking infinitely more difficult.
It really is a constant arms race between the people hiding the data and the people trying to uncover it. But, what if the suspect didn't bother encrypting the files? What if they just tried to completely destroy them?
Yeah.
They deleted the files, emptied the recycle bin, maybe even did a quick format of the drive, leaving only scattered, disorganized fragments of data across the hard drive. When standard recovery software fails because the file system is gone, investigators have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again manually. So let's delve into Section 6. The painstaking process of carving and reconstruction.
Okay, so we have to understand what happens during deletion. When a file is normally deleted, the operating system doesn't immediately scrub the ones and zeros off the physical disk.
Right.
It simply deletes the pointer in the master file table that tells the OS where the file is located, and it marks that physical space on the drive as unallocated, meaning it is free to be overwritten by new data. Until new data is actually saved directly over it, the old data is still sitting there intact in the unallocated space.
Just waiting.
Yep. Data can also be trapped in slack space, which is the empty space at the end of a cluster that isn't fully filled by a smaller file.
And extracting that trapped data without the help of the file table is called carving.
Yes. Recovering any type of file fragments directly from unallocated or slack space, relying purely on recognizing data patterns without the help of the operating system's file system, is called carving. And fun fact, if you're working internationally, particularly outside of North America, this exact same process is frequently referred to as salvaging.
So an investigator needing to perform a data carving extraction has several tools to choose from, like in the Paul case study, right?
Exactly. Like Paul, they can use dedicated automated forensic programs like X-Ways Forensics or OS Forensics. These programs are designed to automatically scan the vast expanse of unallocated space, recognize the mathematical patterns of known file headers, and carve out the fragments they find automatically.
But what if those tools fail?
If an investigator needs to manually rebuild something complex that the automated tools missed or couldn't handle, they will use advanced hexadecimal editors like HXD or comprehensive forensic suites like Autopsy. They use these manual tools to copy the known data patterns from the raw fragments they recovered and then restore the information byte by byte.
Okay, so when we talk about recognizing the patterns of known file headers, we are talking about searching for very specific hexadecimal signatures. Let's look at the Maggie case study. Maggie is staring at a hex editor, which honestly looks like an endless, intimidating wall of numbers and letters, and she's trying to find the start of a deleted JPEG file. What conceptual signature is she actually looking for?
She is looking for the unique, standardized signature that announces a JPEG to the computer. In hexadecimal code, every byte of data is represented by two characters, ranging from 0 to 9 and A to F.
Right.
Maggie's going to scan the raw code, looking for a very specific hexadecimal value at the very beginning of a file, which we call offset 0. For a JPEG, that universal start of image marker is the hex value FFD8.
FFD8, okay.
Furthermore, if it's a standard JPEG or Exif file, she will look a few bytes further in specifically at offset 6 for the label JFIF, which stands for JPEG File Interchange Format. Finding those specific markers tells her exactly where the image begins in the sea of unallocated data.
And if she finds the start of the image, she also needs to verify the specific application marker, like in the Janos case study. Janos knows that right after that FFD8 start marker, he needs to look at offset 2 for the hexadecimal value FFE0.
Yes.
If Janos sees FFD8 followed immediately by FFE0, he knows with absolute mathematical certainty he is looking at the start of a standard JPEG file, regardless of what the file extension was renamed to.
Precisely. And this applies to obscure or older formats as well. For example, an XIF file. If you look at it in a hex editor, you'll see that the first 3 bytes are 4949-2A. Interestingly, those are the exact same first 3 bytes as a standard TIFF file.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the hex 4949 translates to the ASCII letters too. Because automated tools might miss obscure formats, an investigator often has to build their own custom header search string in their forensic software to hunt down these specific rare files based on those exact hex values.
But what happens if the header itself is physically damaged? Let's look at the Ginger case study. Ginger has carved out a large fragment of an image file from unallocated space, but it won't open in any graphics viewer. The header data at the very beginning of the file has been partially overwritten by other random data. The structural container of the file is basically broken. How does she repair it?
She has to repair the damaged header manually. To make this complex process easier, Ginger should open a known, perfectly good image file of the exact same format in her hex editor and place it side by side on the screen with her damaged suspect file.
Just visual comparison.
Right. By carefully comparing the known good header against the suspect file, she can easily spot where the hexadecimal values in the evidence file deviate from the standard or have been overwritten.
Okay.
Once she visually identifies the damaged bytes, she literally types the correct hexadecimal values back into the suspect file to reconstruct the structural header, which hopefully makes the underlying image viewable again.
Okay, wait, I have to jump in here with a massive pushback on the ethics and legality of this. Rebuilding a file's header literally means Ginger is typing new foreign hexadecimal code directly into the evidence. Isn't that the literal definition of tampering with or corrupting the original evidence? How can you possibly present an intentionally altered file in a court of law?
That is the most critical question in digital forensics, and it touches on the absolute golden rule of the profession.
Which is?
If you type new code into the original evidence drive, yes, you have ruined your entire case and potentially committed a crime yourself. The ironclad rule is that you never, ever perform analysis on the original evidence media. You work exclusively on a bitstream, forensically sound copy.
Oh, okay. That's the difference.
Right. When Ginger repairs that damaged header, she's doing it on a carved-out copy of the fragment, far away from the original hard drive. From a strict data standpoint, yes, rebuilding header data is altering the copied file. But the court understands that the goal is to view the contents of the payload, the picture itself. As long as she meticulously documents exactly what hexadecimal values she changed, explains why she changed them based on standard file structures, and mathematically proves that she only repaired the outer structural container of the file without altering the visual image data inside, it is considered a necessary, transparent, and legally sound part of the recovery process.
Okay, documentation and working on copies are everything. So that's repairing a damaged header. But what if the file isn't just missing a header? What if the file was heavily fragmented and is now shattered into multiple pieces scattered randomly across the hard drive? Reconstructing a fragmented file requires a painstaking multi-step process. Let's use the Ursula case study to walk through the reality of putting those pieces back together.
It is essentially digital surgery at a microscopic level. It requires immense patience. So, step 1. Ursula must locate and extract all the individual sectors or clusters of the fragmented file that she can find floating in the unallocated space.
Finding the pieces.
Right. Step 2. She has to carefully analyze the data to determine the starting and ending cluster numbers for each fragmented group of data. She has to figure out the exact mathematical boundaries of each puzzle piece.
Wow, okay.
Step 3. Because she is likely manipulating this in a hex editor like HXD, she must convert those physical starting and ending cluster addresses on the disk into logical offset byte positions so the software can properly navigate to them.
A lot of math involved.
A lot of math. Step 4. She must copy each fragmented group of sectors and paste them in their correct sequential order into a brand new blank recovery file. She is literally stitching the raw data back together.
Incredible.
Step 5. She appends the appropriate file extension to her new recovery file, like .jpg or .png, based on the header she found. Step 6. She rebuilds the file's header if it was damaged, just as we discussed.
And the final step.
Step 7. The moment of truth. She tests the recovered file by opening it in a standard graphics viewer to see if a sequential reconstruction was successful and the image actually appears without massive distortion.
Wow. During this massive search process, though, investigators inevitably run into issues with the search tools themselves. Consider the Jennifer case study. Jennifer is using forensic software to search a massive terabyte hard drive specifically for JPEG files. She inputs the search string FIF because she knows it's part of the JFIF label found in standard JPEG headers.
Right.
But her search results are suddenly flooded with thousands of false positive results that match the search term but have absolutely nothing to do with JPEGs. What went wrong, and how does she fix it?
A false positive occurs when your keyword search string is simply too broad. The three letters FIF can appear naturally in everyday English text documents inside system files or just as random occurrences in compiled binary code.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
To fix this, Jennifer needs to make her search string more mathematically precise. By changing her search from the three letters F to the full four-letter application marker labeled JFIF, she significantly narrows the search parameters. This drastically reduces the number of false positives because that specific four-letter combination is much less likely to occur randomly outside of an actual JPEG header.
What happens if an investigator runs into a file they've just never seen before? The Alyssa case study. Alyssa finds an image file with an extension that is completely alien to her. Her expensive forensic tools don't recognize it and don't know how to render it. How should she proceed to identify it?
The digital world evolves far too fast for any investigator or software suite to recognize every single proprietary format ever created. In this situation, Alyssa should just turn to a standard internet search engine.
Really? Just Google it.
Yes, a general query for the unknown file extension, along with terms like file format or viewer, will usually yield immediate answers. Specifically, she can consult dedicated archive websites like file.org, which exist to maintain massive, constantly updated databases of old, new, and highly obscure file formats, providing the exact hexadecimal signatures and listing the specific applications required to open them.
Before we leave the topic of hiding and finding images, there is one last notorious hiding spot for visual evidence on a Windows machine. Let's look at the Quentin case study. Quentin is an investigator examining a Windows OS looking for trace evidence of illicit videos. The suspect was thorough. They completely deleted the original high-resolution video files, and they are unrecoverable from the unallocated space.
Okay.
But Quentin knows to look for a specific hidden database file that might still hold the evidence. What is it?
He is hunting for the thumbs.db file. When a user opens a folder containing images or videos in Windows, the operating system wants to be helpful. It automatically generates tiny thumbnail images so the user can visually preview the contents quickly.
Right.
To speed things up for the next time the folder is open, Windows takes all those tiny thumbnail images and saves them into a hidden, centralized database file within that folder called thumbs.db. Even if the suspect successfully deletes the original massive video or image, the tiny thumbnail preview often remains permanently trapped inside that forgotten database file. It is incredibly common for digital investigators like Quentin to definitively prove a suspect possessed illicit media simply because the ghost of the file is still sitting perfectly intact in the thumbs.db database.
That perfectly illustrates why suspects can rarely outsmart the file system's automated processes. Okay, we've carved unallocated space, we've rebuilt shattered headers, we've searched hidden databases. Now we have to prove that everything we've done is legally defensible and scientifically sound. We need the ironclad proof. And this brings us to Section 7, the final, critical stage of validation, hashing, and examination planning.
Yeah, the single most critical aspect of digital forensics is validating the digital evidence. Ensuring the absolute mathematical integrity of the data you have collected is the only way it will ever be accepted as evidence in a court of law or a corporate tribunal. And the primary universally accepted mechanism for proving that integrity is hashing.
Let's talk about the nightmare scenario when hashing goes wrong. This is the Debbie case study. Debbie creates a forensic image, a bitstream copy of a suspect's data drive. She runs a SHA-1 hash algorithm on her newly created copy to generate a unique digital fingerprint.
Okay.
Then she runs the exact same algorithm on the original evidence drive. She compares the two hashes and they do not match. The forensic tool throws a massive error indicating the digital evidence is corrupted. What is Debbie's required protocol to correct this?
If the hashes do not match, it means the copy is not an exact, flawless, bit-for-bit replica of the original. Something failed during the acquisition process. It could be a read error on a bad sector, a hardware glitch in the imaging device, or accidental alteration by the software.
Right.
Debbie absolutely cannot just write in her report that the hash failed and hope the judge doesn't notice. Her first and only acceptable procedural step is to completely scrap that corrupted copy, wipe her destination drive, create a brand new forensic image of the original data, and perform the hash validation again.
Start over completely.
Completely. If she cannot eventually get a perfectly matching hash, the copied evidence is legally useless and highly vulnerable to being thrown out.
Hashing isn't just used for validating the integrity of copies, though. It's also deployed as an incredibly powerful search tool. Let's look at Kyle. Kyle is tasked with searching a massive, multi-terabyte corporate server for known illegal files. He wants to make his job as efficient as possible.
Sure.
He wants the software to automatically filter out all the known perfectly safe system files so he doesn't waste hours looking at them, while simultaneously raising a red flag for any known illegal files. What specific database mechanism allows him to do this automatically?
He utilizes a database mechanism known as the known file filter, or KFF. This is a massive hashing database, most famously integrated into a forensic software like FTK or a forensic toolkit.
Okay.
The KFF contains millions of pre-calculated hash values. It has hashes for every single legitimate file found in a standard Windows or Mac installation, so it can mathematically identify and automatically filter those safe files out of Kyle's view, drastically decluttering his workspace.
That's a huge time saver.
Huge. But more importantly, it contains the specific hash values of known illegal files, such as malware signatures or contraband, provided by international law enforcement agencies. If the forensic software hashes a file on the suspect's drive, and it perfectly matches a hash on the illegal list within the KFF, Kyle has an instant, mathematically verified hit for contraband without ever having to manually open the file.
But the KFF is only as good as its last update. Consider the Sergio case study. Sergio just installed a brand new suite of expensive forensic programs on his lab computer straight out of the box. Before he runs his very first scan using the local hash database, what mandatory step must he take?
He absolutely cannot rely on the database that came pre-installed on the software disk or the initial download, because it is almost certainly already out of date.
Right, things move too fast.
Exactly. New software updates are released globally every minute, and new illegal files are identified every single day. Sergio must connect his system to a central, authoritative repository, such as the NIST National Software Reference Library, or NSRL, and download and import the absolute latest updated file hash values into his program. Ensuring the database is entirely current is a mandatory procedural step before any serious analysis begins.
We talked earlier about the painstaking process of carving highly fragmented files. How does the concept of hashing help when a file is broken into tiny pieces across the disk?
It helps through an advanced process called block-wise hashing. Let's say we have an original known illegal file that we are hunting for. We don't just generate one single hash for the whole file. We build a complex dataset containing the individual hash value of every single microscopic sector or block that makes up that file.
Okay.
Then we go to the suspect's drive and systematically hash every single sector on the entire drive. We computationally compare the suspect's millions of sector hashes against our list of known sector hashes.
Wow, so you're matching piece by piece.
Exactly. Even if the suspect completely deleted the file and successfully overwrote 99% of it, if even one single microscopic sector of the original file remains intact in the unallocated space, block-wise hashing will identify that fragment, mathematically proving that the specific illegal file was once present on the drive.
It's like finding a single unique puzzle piece in the trash and using its specific shape to mathematically prove the entire puzzle was once in the house. Unbelievable. Okay. Before we wrap up this deep dive, we need to talk about the practical reality of actually conducting an investigation in the field. Because you can't just plug in and start digging randomly. You need a highly structured examination plan.
Exactly. The entire process for examining digital evidence depends heavily on the specific nature of the investigation. In civil and criminal cases, the scope of what you are allowed to do is strictly defined by legal documents. So, search warrants, court orders, or subpoenas. Those documents dictate exactly what specific types of data you are legally authorized to recover and examine. Searching haphazardly or purely out of curiosity is not only highly inefficient, it can violate the legal scope of a warrant, infringe on privacy rights, and ultimately get the entire case and all your evidence thrown out of court.
Let's explore two different investigative scenarios. First, the Jeremiah case study. Jeremiah is an investigator working at a private sector forensics lab handling a civil litigation case for a large corporation. There are no police search warrants or subpoenas telling him what he can or cannot look at. How should he approach building his examination plan?
Even without the strict boundaries of a legal warrant, a private sector investigator like Jeremiah must remain highly disciplined. His examination plan should be broad enough to comprehensively encompass all the evidence relevant to the corporate client's specific complaint or internal policy violation. But it must not be so wide-ranging that he ends up wasting massive amounts of billable time and resources analyzing completely irrelevant personal data. It requires a delicate balance of investigative thoroughness and corporate efficiency.
And what about an internal corporate investigation, the Naomi case study? Naomi is an IT investigator looking into an employee who is suspected of running a personal, unauthorized side business using company laptops during work hours. As she begins examining the computer, she finds preliminary evidence that the employee is running an online e-commerce store. Based on this specific suspicion, where should Naomi focus her examination plan to be most effective?
She needs to target the specific areas of the operating system that facilitate unauthorized online activity and communication. She should focus heavily on temporary internet files and the detailed internet browsing history to see exactly what external websites the employee was visiting.
Right.
She should deeply examine the corporate email programs, looking for unauthorized communication with outside customers or suppliers. And she should meticulously check the Windows registry for artifacts indicating any unauthorized third-party software they may have installed to help run their business. In this scenario, she wouldn't necessarily need to waste days carving the massive unallocated space for hidden encrypted partitions unless the initial surface evidence explicitly pointed in that direction.
But what happens when the initial surface evidence does point somewhere completely unexpected? Consider the Maya case study. Maya is working on a standard corporate intellectual property theft case. She successfully finds the stolen data, but while doing so, she unexpectedly stumbles upon clear evidence of an entirely different, massive crime, say a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme.
Wow.
Now the corporate attorneys are demanding she investigate the embezzlement as well. The investigation is ballooning rapidly past the original plan. What is the industry term for this phenomenon?
That is called scope creep. It is the result of an investigation expanding dramatically beyond its original authorized description, because the unexpected discovery of new evidence exponentially increases the amount of work required.
Yeah.
Scope creep has actually become much more common in both corporate and criminal investigations because attorneys and prosecutors frequently demand deeper, more detailed examinations of peripheral evidence right before a trial to strengthen their overall case.
Let me ask you a practical business question about that. With scope creep constantly threatening to derail a project, how does an investigator balance the intense pressure for a corporate client or a prosecutor to just keep looking against the harsh realities of a limited financial budget, a tight legal deadline, and finite technical resources?
It requires constant, clear communication and rigorous expectation management. When scope creep inevitably occurs, the investigator must formally pause the analysis and present the new findings to the primary stakeholder.
Communication is key.
Absolutely. You have to explicitly say, we found evidence X, which strongly implies crime Y. Fully investigating crime Y will require an additional 40 hours of deep analysis and will cost an additional Z dollars. Do you formally authorize the expansion of the examination plan? You must deliberately revise the written examination plan and get formal sign-off. An investigator cannot simply absorb the massive amount of extra work into the original timeline and budget and hope for the best.
Communication and boundaries are key to survival in this field. So, tying this entire complex process together, the industry outlines that all digital forensic examinations essentially follow three main structured stages. What are they?
Stage 1 is preparing for the examination. The absolute first task before you analyze a single byte is to preserve all evidence. You must use recently wiped, forensically sterilized media to make your bitstream copies. If you are dealing with modern solid-state drives or flash drives, immediate preservation is critical because their built-in garbage collection routines can permanently alter or destroy data on their own while powered on. During preparation, you document the physical hardware, check the BIOS and CMS dates for accuracy, and firmly establish your objective based on the original request.
Right. Get the playing field set, secured, and legally documented.
Stage 2 is conducting the examination. This is where the actual technical analysis occurs. You list the directories, examine the file contents, utilize dictionary attacks to crack password-protected files, run your hash comparisons against the KFF, meticulously carve the unallocated space for deleted fragments, and identify the true function of unknown executable files using hex headers.
Okay.
And you do all of this methodically while maintaining strict physical and digital security of your lab area.
And finally,
Stage 3 is reporting the findings. You compile absolutely everything you found, detail exactly the scientific methods you used to find it, and explain what it means in a clear, legally defensible document that a non-technical judge or jury can understand. These three core stages, prepare, conduct, report, are the foundational framework that must be continuously modified and adapted to fit the specific, unique requirements of every single case you take on.
The scale of what we have covered today is just immense. We started by peeling back the invisible layers of a standard digital photograph, exploring the depths of raw sensor data, Exif metadata, and the undeniable proof of geolocation.
Yep.
We looked at the mathematical trade-offs of lossy versus lossless compression and how it impacts image degradation. We exposed the digital invisibility cloaks of steganography, finding hidden messages buried in the least significant bits of an image and the source code of an HTML file.
We also uncovered the system-level tricks suspects use to hide their tracks from casual observers, changing file extensions to confuse the OS, bit-shifting binary code into unreadable gibberish, hiding partitions by stripping away drive letters, and reviving the classic FAT file system trick of fraudulently marking good clusters as bad to create hidden vaults.
We talked about breaking the locks of encryption, using brute force attacks, leveraging psychological profiling for dictionary attacks, and utilizing the massive speed advantage of pre-computed rainbow tables, and how the simple act of salting ruins them. We literally rebuilt shattered files from the unallocated space by carving fragments, aligning cluster boundaries, and manually repairing hexadecimal headers.
Incredible stuff.
And we wrapped it all up by cementing the absolute ironclad need for data validation through hashing, using databases like the known file filter to automate the hunt, and strictly managing our examination plans to survive the threat of scope creep.
It really is a massive, complex journey from analyzing a simple JPEG on a smartphone to presenting a reconstructed, mathematically validated piece of evidence in a courtroom or corporate boardroom.
Which brings us right back to the suspect we talked about at the very beginning of the show, that digital ghost. They thought their deleted, format-changed, hidden, and bit-shifted files were safe from prying eyes. They truly thought they had outsmarted the system. But because you, the listener, now understand hexadecimal headers, unallocated space carving, LSB substitution, and FF hash databases, well, that suspect has nowhere left to hide. The file system always remembers.
And now you possess the foundational knowledge to make it talk.
Before we go, a quick reminder to please like, subscribe, and share this content with your peers. Explore the channel for other videos, playlists, and classes. Whether you are studying at Tarleton State University or anywhere else in the world, taking ownership of your career growth, mastering these technical concepts, and embracing lifelong learning is what will truly set you apart in the competitive business and tech landscape.
Join us next time as we continue our journey and jump into Chapter 9, where the environment gets even more volatile and dynamic. Virtual machine forensics and live acquisitions forensics. We will be looking at the delicate process of capturing evidence from systems that are currently powered on and actively running without pulling the plug and losing the volatile memory.
It's going to be a fascinating shift in tactics, but I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Think about the very device you are using to listen to this deep dive right now. Your smartphone, your tablet, your laptop. You have deleted countless photos, uninstalled dozens of apps, and cleared your recycle bin over the years. If an investigator were to plug into your device right now, bypass the operating system, and run a carving tool across your unallocated space, what ghosts of your past data would they pull back into the light?
That is a chilling thought for anyone.
That's a wrap on this episode of Digital Forensics. Until next time, analyze the copy, preserve the original.